Sisters, colleagues, friends, thank you for the wonderful invitation to participate via 21st century technology. It's really an honour to be here at the Countess Markievicz School. When Niamh Murray extended your kind invitation to participate, we agreed that given the communications issues which consumed my activism in the 1980s and the 1990s, it would be particularly appropriate to leverage contemporary media to bridge the geographical distance and challenge presented by my inability to be physically present with you today. My colleagues from the days of our Freedom of Information campaigns will remember my frustration that we were even having what seemed to me to be a 19th century argument about censorship of publications, about who could say what to whom, when satellites were bouncing unfiltered images across the universe in real time. And yes, that would be the Eurovision Song Contest. So here we are today, and I'm very grateful to be here. Thank you. I've been asked to outline my personal trajectory as an activist. Yikes. Here goes. That would be, I was born into a repressive society. I yelled no. I found others who also yelled no. We figured out how to make the kind of noise together that results in legal reforms, while also helping some women in crises we identified as patriarchally engineered. I made a sort of difference, and I've left a legacy of sorts. I fulfilled enough of my self-imposed personal debt to my mother, who died young of being a woman who had come of age in mid-century Ireland, and of my family-identified debt to a country which provided me with a free and rather fine education. I've moved on, finding more age-appropriate challenges to engage my eldering time and energies. And what is it that I did exactly? Well, I asserted that women in Ireland have a right to information about lawful extraterritorial services, including abortion, successfully arguing the point before the European Court of Human Rights in the Door Counselling case in 1992. This right is now enshrined somewhat haphazardly in Irish constitution and law. I also codified principles and procedures for client-centred non-directive pregnancy counselling, which were adopted by the Irish Family Planning Association when it introduced its publicly funded nationwide service in 1993. These protocols continue to be implemented and are taught as best practices. In support of these goals, I ran a formal counselling service from 1981 to 1986, founding Open Door Counselling in 1993 at the height of the Article 43.3, the Eighth Amendment campaign. I managed an informal informational hotline and counselling referral service from my home phone from 1986 through 1993 and consulted with the IFPA in 1993. All in all, my colleagues and I responded to many hundreds of women with pregnancies they described as presenting a crisis in their lives. And we did it within the framework of the law, because we had a duty of care to our clients, even as in our personal capacities we campaigned for change. And of course, I spent countless hours writing, speaking, touring, lecturing, broadcasting, editorializing, publishing, and generally droning on about the philosophical urgency of our slogan, a woman's right to choose. I didn't do any of this on my own, and I didn't do any of it perfectly. and I certainly didn't realise my personal agenda for feminism in Ireland. I did make lifelong friendships with people I love and admire, and I didn't make a dime. As planned, I aged out of frontline activism at age 40. I remain convinced that reproductive rights requires the leadership of young women, and that it's the responsibility of younger generations to identify their priorities and strategize accordingly. If I can help you, I'll be delighted. Nowadays, I write for Conscience, the newsjournal of Catholics for Choice, an international non-profit advocacy organisation headquartered in Washington, D.C. The long-term CFC president is a Dubliner, a friend from his early work in the IFPA. For those of you who remember the 1980s case of the virgin condom, that was the same John O'Brien. Catholics for Choice was founded in 1973 to serve as a voice for Catholics who believe that the Catholic tradition supports a woman's moral and legal right to follow her conscience in matters of sexuality and reproductive health. That's a healing message, and one with continued relevance. How is it that I became so involved as an activist? The roots of my feminism undoubtedly lie in the dreadful social conditions for women into which I was born. Who now would believe that women, for example, were forcibly retired from civil service careers on their wedding days, as my mother was? Or that women weren't allowed to serve on juries, even in trials of women? Or that women couldn't be served pints of beer in so-called public houses, or at all? Or a myriad of gender-based discriminations and daily humiliations, from the seemingly trivial to the incontrovertibly egregious. One of the linchpin outrages of the day, to which I responded viscerally, was highlighted by Nuala Fennell in Hibernia in the late 1970s. And it is this: in the absence of legal divorce, men in Ireland were empowered to lock away their wives in mental institutions. These committals were involuntary and interminable. I salute Fennell's crusading journalism and an advocacy which led to a career in mainstream politics as Ireland's first ever Minister for Women's Affairs. Or what about the nuns who told my class of barely menstruating females that if it came to fetal distress in childbirth, the attending physician is required to privilege the baby, even at the sacrifice of the mother? This was a hard message to hear as a girl. This message was delivered, of course, in the context of a complete ban on contraception. Thus, the nuns may take their share of credit for my activism, and indeed in the early years they claimed me for their own, even as they no doubt disputed my opinions. Also radicalizing was Paul VI's encyclical on contraception, Humanae Vitae. Still a schoolgirl when it was published, I read the English language version in one of the quality Sunday English newspapers, and it was extensively discussed at the family dinner table. My parents thought the encyclical a terrible mistake and a betrayal of Vatican II, the source of hope for many distressed Roman Catholics looking for modernization in the Church. I just thought it was nonsense. In due course, I was on the streets of Dublin, marching for legalised contraception, a political goal which I also wanted to achieve for personal reasons. I was young, I was in love, I was sexual, I was sexually active. In my story, the true nexus of the personal and the political was spontaneous and unplanned. You could say I was in the right place at the right time. A public meeting of the grassroots Women's Right to Choose group in Liberty Hall in 1981. The meeting was chaired by Mary McAleese, already a force in Irish public life, although none of us expected at the time that she would become the second female President of Ireland. Journalist Mary Holland, whose work I had long admired, spoke from the platform about her abortion, the first woman in Ireland to do so. After Mary excused herself for family reasons, anti-choicers present spoke very abusively about her, and I was incensed. Naturally, I spoke up, identifying myself as both Irish and a woman who'd recently had an abortion herself. In that passionate moment, the purpose and practice, the destiny of my next 15 years was set. The personal is political is a slogan popularized in the heady days of so-called second wave feminism. In the throes of idealistic youth, this is a hard message. It seems to undercut the high-mindedness of our cause. We prefer to highlight the justice of our mission, the selflessness of our commitment. When I found feminism as both politics and philosophy, and for that I thank you, Germaine Greer and the Female Eunuch, I was energized by the possibilities for world betterment. So much to change, so much time, a whole generation in which to do it. In a generation, there's no doubt that we did succeed in making a lot of necessary change. Some of it for sure at a superficial level. But I don't say that lightly. It's way more comfortable to live with superficial improvements than without. And if you doubt me, I invite you to check out television's Mad Men. 1960s Madison Avenue mores and ethos were very much alive in my Ireland of the 1970s and the 1980s. For those of you not yet twinkles in your parents' eyes, the 1980s in Ireland may be reasonably characterized as a period of second partitioning, or what we now know as culture wars. The implicit struggle for Ireland's future was between the waning authoritarianism of the state's founding fathers, McQuaid and De Valera, who both died in the early 1970s, and an increasingly cosmopolitan culture simultaneously focused on America, the European Union, and economic development. The Roman Catholic centre could not hold, but a frightened laity retrenched around issues they found deeply threatening, specifically abortion and divorce, both subjects of 1980s referenda so deeply divisive as to bear hallmarks of civil war. Those feminists, such as myself, who had spent our youngest days working to mainstream hitherto silenced issues such as domestic violence, rape, unwanted pregnancy, were obvious targets for generally inchoate anger simmering to the surface. When I was formally interviewed by a very senior Garda in the mid-80s, I asked why a complaint against open door counselling was made under the law, specifically the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act, when the same paths of social protest and change were open to my complainants as to me. His memorable reply was an eye-opener. You may not like some of the ways our society does business, Ruth, but you believe that by and large society functions, and that your political representation and rational argument can have an improving effect. In short, you belong. Your complainants, by contrast, believe their whole existence is under mortal threat from people like you. When you're under threat, you call the cops. Well, this was news to me. A lesson from the inside on the nature of democracy as played out at senior levels of the modern Irish state. I understood in that moment that at a fundamental level, Irish society had already moved on, not per my feminist agenda to be sure, but away from the darkest of the dark ages. And these are the nuances that inform our strategy moving forward. Not so long after this conversation, the President of the High Court referred to me and my colleagues as well-intended and highly qualified professionals, providing much-needed services. It occurred to me that notwithstanding that the High Court was shutting down my service agency in this judgment, our efforts had ineffably moved into the halls of the establishment. Thus, it was unlikely that I would see the inside of a jail on contempt charges for all that I broadcast my availability to convey taboo information via my listed home phone number, and this on the front page of the Irish Times. And equally, it was highly likely that I would get a positive hearing in the European Court of Human Rights, but not before Open Doors senior counsel read without interruption the feminist-inspired principles and procedures of client-centred, non-directive pregnancy counselling into the record of the Irish Supreme Court. So much for the political. What about the personal? These days, I often refer to the period of my sustained activism as one in which I made a public nuisance of myself. I'm only half joking. My insistence on arguing the point through the courts was at best unladylike, for all the contemporary editorial referencing my characteristic pearls and my red nail polish, well, some things do change. I was a determined, polarizing figure, and my uncompromising rhetoric was uncomfortable to many colleagues. I still have personal amends to make from this period. Further, writer Ronit Lenton once told me that our work relies on tremendous and often hidden support from our nearest and dearest. It's not enough to be politically committed. We must be personally resourced. Thus, the domestic and emotional support of my family of adoption was key to my availability and my achievements in the public square. But in the arrogance of my political moment, in the conviction that I was doing the right thing, I had neglected to explicitly recruit my partner and his family to the stresses of my mission. The unforeseen demands on them over a decade were hellacious. Credit for the patience and generosity of the O'Brolachán family is way overdue. Additionally, it was only the pro bono contribution of my voluntary legal team in both the domestic courts and later at Strasbourg that could give teeth to my assertion that I would fight forever for the right to disseminate information both as a private citizen and as a reputable pregnancy counselling service provider. As Hillary Rodham Clinton's favourite cliche reminds us, it takes a village, a personal and political community, not an ideological isolate. And so we speak of movements, even as we recognise and honour the individual energies that animate them. So much for all that. What can it serve emerging activists to rake over these old coals? Those of you historians who enjoy such stories will find the details fresh in newspaper and television archives. But like all of us, I'm also concerned that each generation of feminists needs to reinvent its political consciousness along with its agenda. Our stories are purposefully lost in projects of ideological forgetting. For example, filmmaker Lelia Doolan, herself no stranger to controversy, speaks of the difficulty in securing funds for her exemplary 2012 documentary on forgotten Bernadette Devlin, once among the most famous people on the planet, and this a mere 40 years ago. These truths demand that we document our history in our own time. And that history in turn contextualizes present struggles. We don't look back to marinate, but to understand that we carry our foremothers' incomplete and imperfect work into new challenges. I appreciate that these remarks may not be the benignant trip down memory lane or even the rallying cry which may have been anticipated in your kind invitation. I'm not great on my greatest hits. And this writing hasn't been a particularly pleasant experience. I do not deny the necessity of my activism nor its achievements, but my memories of the time are at best emotionally mixed. It was the feminist theologian Mary Daly who observed that the deeper we get into women's history, the worse the news. Why should I be any different? So, my advice to the younger activist: own your agenda. You are not obliged to pick up on my unfinished business unless we explicitly share your mission and want to work together. Do not curb your enthusiasm. Politics is a long-term process dotted with events, some of which turn in your favor. Get a life. You can only save the world if the people who love you, yourself included, are right along there with you. Keep your activism in perspective. Your cause will not keep you warm in that dark night of the soul which is the price of admission to the human race. Only your radical honesty will do that. Know your enemy. The dualism that's so much a part of our philosophical framework and political discourse is a lie. We're all in this together, but power relations are unbalanced. Our mission is always to serve the powerless, ourselves included, however and wherever we find our authentic mission and can deploy our talents, but not at the expense of our precious humanity. Remember that life is multi-circular, not linear, with surprising opportunities for redo. You will enjoy these adventures and epiphanies if you keep faith with your principles. And take comfort from the fact that nobody and nothing is perfect. Perfection is the fanatic's lie, and it's particularly attractive when you're young and untested. You don't have to be victim to that lie. In closing, I can only hope that this reflection on the personal is political, as it has played out in my life thus far, helps you navigate the next chapters in your personal stories and in the necessary political campaigns of today and tomorrow. Learn from me by all means. Learn from my mistakes. Forgive me and move on. Good luck and thank you.